Welcome back to Mystery Case X. Today, continuing the true crime series, we are going to talk about a killer known as a serial murderer and cannibal, responsible for a string of crimes including murder, rape, and dismemberment of his victims. His total victim count was 17 people, among them men and underage boys. His crimes took place between 1978 and 1991. Among those crimes, there were cases in which he consumed the flesh of his victims and kept body parts as specimens, souvenirs, and even decorations inside his home. His name was Jeffrey Dahmer, born on May 21, 1960. A feature film of the same name was made about him, the 2002 movie Dahmer, in which he was portrayed by actor Jeremy Renner, who also plays Hawkeye in The Avengers. Interestingly, many people have commented that the actor is not even as good-looking as the real man was in life. Beyond that, the name Jeffrey Dahmer has also been referenced in American Horror Story, Season 6, as well as in the widely acclaimed 2017 film Get Out. He ultimately received 15 consecutive life sentences for crimes connected to the 17 murders, a staggering total amounting to nearly 1,000 years in prison. Now, let us go deeper into the crimes he committed and examine the psychology of this cold-blooded, deeply animalistic killer. There is actually one case where, had American police been more careful, they might have caught him then, and there potentially preventing at least 5 subsequent murders. That is the case involving a young boy named Konarak Synthosamphone, a Laotian boy. This 14-year-old boy was spotted one day by 2 women walking down the street. They saw a naked boy running in a state of panic. The 2 women went over to help by holding him in place and calling the police. When police arrived, there was also a blonde-haired man standing there. He told them the boy was 19 years old and was his gay partner. At the time, Konarak had just been drugged, so he was unable to express himself or speak coherently. On top of that, he was Laotian and could barely understand what anyone around him was saying. That blonde man was Jeffrey Dahmer. As mentioned at the start, he was quite handsome in appearance, and his manner of speaking was very smooth and convincing, which led the police to believe him. Konarak, meanwhile, was in a state of panic and could say almost nothing. Even when the officers heard Dahmer explain that this was his gay partner and that the boy was already 19, the 2 women who had been helping the boy felt deeply uneasy. They had seen with their own eyes how terrified the boy had looked moments before. They believed the boy was being harmed. To investigate, police accompanied Jeffrey Dahmer and the boy to Dahmer's home. From this point, I will refer to him simply as Jeff. Once there, Jeff showed police a photograph of the boy wearing a swimsuit inside the apartment, offered as proof that he really was Jeff's boyfriend, and that everything was perfectly normal. The boy sat silently on the sofa, saying nothing. Using his way with words, Jeff kept apologizing for the disturbance and promised it would never happen again. The police believed him. They also appeared reluctant to get involved in anything related to a same-sex relationship, and so they left. And in doing so, they missed everything. Had they gone further inside, they would have found a body in a state of decomposition in that apartment. And they did not know that the moment they left, Jeff strangled the 14-year-old Laotian boy to death. He then had intercourse with the corpse before dismembering the body. The head was kept as a trophy in his room. On July 22, 1991, 2 police officers on patrol in Milwaukee came across a man running naked and in a panic in the area they were covering. He had a handcuff still attached to his wrist. Police stopped him initially suspecting he had escaped from some kind of detention facility because of the cuff. The man told them everything. His name was Tracy Edwards. He had just escaped from Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment. He said he had been assaulted there and had barely managed to get out. He then led police to apartment 213 in the Oxford Apartments complex. When they arrived, they first asked Jeff to produce the key to remove the handcuffs from Tracy Edwards. Then they stepped inside. What met their eyes was a scene of horror that in all likelihood they would never forget for the rest of their lives. Photographs of naked bodies, dismembered corpses, and human body parts were spread throughout the images found there. But the photographs alone were not even the full extent of it. When they opened the refrigerator, they found a human head inside. Police immediately arrested Jeff and called for backup, while also alerting media outlets and news stations to come and cover the scene. When everyone arrived, every officer, reporter, and member of the press was utterly stunned. They entered the apartment and found a pressure cooker at the far end of the room. Inside it were several hands and various body parts in various stages of decomposition. On a shelf, 2 skulls were mounted. They also discovered chemicals including ethanol and formaldehyde substances used to preserve remains. Jeff had been using these compounds to preserve the body parts he kept as keepsakes. Among the photographs Jeff had taken himself, investigators found an image of a man's head sitting in a kitchen sink. Another showed him cutting open a body with a deep, long incision running down the entire length of the torso. And there were many more photographs in which the deceased victims had been posed in sexually explicit positions reminiscent of pornographic material. At this point, the entire media world, and the American public in particular, was desperate to understand what horrors had been taking place inside apartment 213. As investigators dug deeper into the case and into the man himself, they were increasingly shocked to find that some of the crimes were even worse than anything they had initially imagined. It became known that his interest in what is called necrophilia, meaning sexual attraction to corpses, had its roots in his thinking from around the age of 15 or 16. But it was not until he graduated from high school in 1978 that he carried out his first murder. At that time, he had become acquainted with a man named Stephen Hicks. The two drank beer together and had a sexual encounter. Afterward, it appeared Stephen wanted to leave as though it had simply been a one-time encounter for him. Jeff would not allow it. He picked up a dumbbell and struck Stephen over the head with it, killing him instantly. He then proceeded to cut the body into pieces, doing so with a cold, practiced efficiency. Bones were separated from flesh, each dealt with separately, much like a butcher sorting cuts of meat. The flesh was placed into garbage bags. The bones were wrapped up and smashed into fragments with a hammer. The remains were then buried in the woods behind the house. Jeff was a severe alcoholic. He drank as though it were water. Wherever he went and whatever he did, alcohol was involved. In October 1981, he was arrested for public intoxication and disorderly conduct. Things were still somewhat manageable at that point. But 4 years later, in 1986, he was arrested again, this time for exposing himself and masturbating in front of 2 young boys. He was arrested and placed on probation. His second victim was a man named Stephen Tuomi. On November 20th, 1987, Jeff met him at a bar. The two went back to a hotel together, continued drinking, and had sexual relations. But when Jeff woke the next morning, Stephen Tuomi was dead. Jeff could not even recall how he had caused the death. He could only see that the victim's chest had been caved in, and that blood had come from his mouth and nose. Although Jeff recognized that he was the one responsible, he genuinely could not remember what he had done. He had been that intoxicated. To dispose of the body, he first hung a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the hotel room door to keep staff away. He then went to a nearby shopping center and purchased a large suitcase, stuffed Stephen Tuomi's body inside, and transported it home. There he began sawing off the head, the hands, and the legs. After stripping the flesh, he sliced it into smaller pieces. He then used bed sheets and certain chemicals to wrap the bones before pulverizing them with a hammer. The entire process took approximately 2 hours. Everything was disposed of in the trash except for the head, which he kept. Since his father was a chemistry doctorate, Jeff had picked up some knowledge in that area. He attempted to use chemical compounds to preserve the skull, intending to keep it as a trophy. However, it appears his knowledge of chemistry only went so far. The compounds were not used in the correct proportions, so not only was the skull not preserved, it was damaged and fell apart. After this second killing, it was as though the beast within him had fully emerged. He was no longer killing at random, but began actively hunting for victims in bars. In March 1988, Jeff befriended a young male sex worker who was a Native American, a 14-year-old boy named Jamie Dockstader. He offered the boy $50 just to come back to his apartment and let him take a few nude photographs. The boy agreed. After arriving at Jeff's place, that was the last time the boy would ever be seen alive. Jeff drugged him, had intercourse with him, then strangled him to death. He again sawed off the head to keep the skull and divided the rest of the body into flesh and bone for disposal. On May 14, 1990, Jeffrey Dahmer moved out of his grandmother's house and into his own apartment at number 213. And there the savage killing continued. In roughly 15 months, he killed a total of 12 people. The frenzy reached its peak between approximately May and July of 1991. During that period, he was killing roughly one person per week. Among his victims in that stretch were 3 black men, 1 white man, 1 Laotian, and 1 Hispanic. It was also discovered that he did not merely kill, have intercourse with corpses, and dismember them. He also consumed the flesh of his victims. In his mind, eating the flesh meant that the victim would become a part of him, absorbed into his own body and his own being, as though by consuming them he could incorporate those people into himself. Does that not turn your stomach? I was actually in the middle of eating beef stew when I had to stop entirely. So, why did he become this savage? How could a person turn into something that close to a monster? And, honestly, even a monster might not be as horrifying as he was. There are actually very few truly convincing answers, even though many people have written entire books analyzing his psychology. Some attribute it to a troubled childhood, to poor parenting, to a head injury he sustained that required surgery, or to the effects of his severe alcoholism. Many analyses have been put forward. Growing up, he had parents. As mentioned, his father held a doctorate in chemistry, and his mother suffered from poor health and was frequently ill. Over time, a growing distance developed between his parents. They appeared to no longer want to be together, though they had not yet divorced. His father regularly found excuses to stay at work in order to avoid being home. By the time Jeff was 8, they had divorced. According to Jeffrey Dahmer's father, however, he did not believe this was the primary cause. He saw it as one contributing factor among several that shaped a person as disturbed as his son. When the parents separated, his mother took Jeff's younger sibling and moved elsewhere to rent a place. His father moved in with a new partner. That left Jeff alone in the house in conditions where there was virtually no one to care for him, no one to talk to, and possibly even insufficient food. After moving to Ohio, the boy apparently had no friends whatsoever. None at all. Despite being described as gentle in temperament with a somewhat scholarly and pleasant appearance that tended to create a good impression, he seemed unable to connect with anyone. And from that point, he began to reveal his disturbing interests. He would regularly search the roadsides and surrounding areas for dead animals, bring them home, skin them, behead them, strip the bones and bury them in the backyard. Over time, the area behind the house came to resemble a private little cemetery of his own making. His father once discovered him beheading a dog and mounting the head on a stake driven into the ground in that same backyard cemetery. It was also around this same time that he entered puberty. Curiosity and sexual urges began to stir. Whether it was connected to his habit of handling the remains of dead animals or not, his emerging sexual orientation developed in an unusual direction. On one hand, he came to understand that he was not attracted to girls and that he was gay. On the other, he began to form thoughts about wanting sexual contact with corpses. As a young child, he had been somewhat sharp and even a little mischievous. But after going through these upheavals, he became withdrawn and sullen, very different from other children his age. He stopped arguing with his parents entirely, but at the same time stopped wanting any emotional attention from the people around him. And when he committed offenses, whether masturbating in front of children, harassing minors, or even killing his father, would hire skilled lawyers to defend him, getting him off the charges, or reducing them to the minimum. But no one took any steps to actually correct his behavior, or draw him back toward any sense of family connection, or basic humanity. And so he drifted further and further into distortion from his sexual urges to the savage things he did to dead bodies. According to one psychological researcher, Jeffrey Dahmer was a serial killer of a particularly unusual type because he could not control himself and was driven by extremely disturbed thoughts that dominated his mind. But there was one key difference between him and most other killers. Most killers stop when the victim is dead. He did not. After the victim was dead, it was only then, with his warped and distorted mentality, that he began to feel something like pleasure. It was only at that point that the experience felt like a real game to him. He would have intercourse with the corpses, and he was intensely aroused by acts such as decapitating and dismembering the bodies. That was the moment in his mind when he was truly savoring what he had done. It seemed that only through this could he satisfy the deviant sexual urges within him. It was also established that he suffered from a condition known as borderline personality disorder. Let me read you an analysis of that condition. Childhood stress can contribute to the development of borderline personality disorder. A childhood history of physical or sexual abuse, abandonment, separation from a caregiver, or the loss of a parent are all commonly found in patients diagnosed with this disorder. Jeffrey Dahmer's case closely matches the abandonment aspect of that description. As a child, he was not subjected to physical or sexual abuse, But he was effectively abandoned after his parents divorced. He was left alone and lived with a deep and persistent sense of isolation. The symptoms associated with borderline personality disorder also indicate that when patients feel abandoned or neglected, they experience intense fear that then escalates into extreme anger. That corresponds closely to what researchers have observed about Jeffrey Dahmer. Because he lived constantly inside loneliness, stress, and the feeling of being abandoned, he drowned himself in alcohol. He began drinking at a very young age and became an alcoholic without even realizing when it happened. Even after joining the military, he continued drinking. He would sneak alcohol in. He was also accused of drugging a fellow soldier and sexually assaulting that person, and was ultimately discharged from the military because of this and because of his alcoholism. Even while still in school, he regularly hid alcohol in his water bottle and found ways to drink past his teachers. That alone says enough about the severity of his addiction. The trial that followed his arrest was one of the most heavily secured in Milwaukee's history. Bomb-sniffing dogs were deployed, and everyone entering the courtroom was subjected to thorough searches. Jeff sat isolated in a bulletproof glass enclosure with maximum level protection. There were genuine fears that members of the public, consumed with hatred for him, might attempt to kill him right there in the courtroom before the proceedings could conclude. Security was extremely tight. His defense attorney wanted to persuade the court that he was legally insane, arguing that only a person who was mentally ill could have committed acts of such depravity. If the court accepted an insanity defense, he might have avoided prison altogether and been committed to a psychiatric institution instead. However, Jeffrey Dahmer himself refused to go along with that line of argument. He insisted that he was not insane. At the conclusion of the trial, he was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, amounting to 957 years in prison, nearly 1,000 years. One curious thing was that once inside prison, he appeared very well behaved and agreeable, presenting himself at all times as a model inmate. Initially, the other prisoners did not accept him, so he was kept separate. In response, he worked hard to demonstrate good conduct and genuine rehabilitation in order to persuade the guards to allow him to integrate with the general prison population. And it was precisely that politeness and his seemingly sincere rehabilitation that led to his being accepted into the shared living and dining arrangements of the wider prisoner community, which ultimately led to his death. On November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer was beaten to death by a fellow inmate. Not just killed, but beaten so severely that his face was reportedly left disfigured beyond recognition. And so ended the criminal life of one of America's most notorious serial killers. Looking at the story of this killer, a common thread does emerge. Children who are not properly cared for, attended to, and loved by their families can grow up to develop distortions that are almost impossible to predict. This family had its cracks from early on, leading to his parents' divorce, which left him in isolation and without direction. And as his psychology changed, his parents were not there to monitor or correct it in time. What they knew how to do when he committed offenses or crimes was hire good lawyers to get him off or reduce the charges. But they took no meaningful steps to bring him back, to reconnect him with any sense of family, or to remind him of his basic humanity. And so he drifted further and further into distortion in both his sexual desires and the savage things he did to the dead. In my own view, had those family upheavals not occurred, It is quite possible that with his looks and intelligence, he could have become a genuinely useful member of society, perhaps even a talented one. After all, he had his father's genes. His father held a chemistry doctorate, and earning a doctorate in America is no small thing. He may well have had real ability, but in the end, those abilities were not directed toward anything good. They were pulled toward crime instead. The capacity for surgery and anatomical dissection that he possessed, rather than being used in medicine, was put in service of killing and feeding the obsessive, pathological fixation that consumed him. And that is what people mean when they say that even shoes have a destiny. No one knows when a child is born, whether they will grow into a decent human being or a killer. Everything in that child's environment plays an enormous role. Even while in prison, Jeff said more than once that this was not his parents' fault. And truthfully, it cannot be pinned entirely on any one person. Perhaps it was the fault of fate, of family circumstance, and of the criminal choices he himself made. But this killer was far more extreme than most, and so he became a symbol of something monstrous, something like a devil wearing a human face in America during that era. That is all for today's video. Remember to subscribe to the channel to keep up with upcoming videos. Thank you all very much.